On August 15, 1971, the world quietly stepped into a new financial reality. In a single announcement, President Nixon killed the last link between the US dollar and gold. Before 1971, money was a claim on real gold. That idea shaped the global financial system for decades. Under the gold standards, countries fixed their currencies to gold, and the US dollar became the anchor. After World War II, when most nations were in ruins, the Bretton Woods Conference locked in a new order. The dollar would be convertible into gold at $35 an ounce, and every other major currency would peg itself to the dollar. The setup worked because the US held more than 20,000 tons of gold, which was over half of the world's reserves. Confidence in the dollar wasn't just political, it was physical. Nations trust the US because they knew they could always exchange their dollars for gold. As global trade picked up, the dollar became the backbone of international transactions, and America emerged as the unquestioned economic leader. For a while, the system looked unshakable, but the stability everyone relied on depended on one thing: the US actually having enough gold to back all the dollars circulating worldwide. And by the late 1950s and early 1960s, cracks started to show. The world was swimming in dollars far more than the US had to cover. As America grew into a superpower, its spending grew even faster. The Korean War, the Vietnam War, the space race, and sweeping social programs under the Great Society all demanded money. Money the US didn't actually have in gold. Washington kept printing dollars, confident the world would keep trusting them. But trust has limits. By the mid-1960s, the imbalance was impossible to hide. There were simply too many dollars circulating outside of the US, and not enough gold sitting in American vaults to honor them. Other nations noticed, especially France under President Charles de Gaulle. In 1965, he publicly called out the US for abusing its position and demanded gold in exchange for French-held dollars. That was much more than a diplomatic job. It exposed the core flaw in the system. France began withdrawing gold. Others quietly followed. Shipments of US gold flowed overseas as countries converted their dollars back into the metal. Confidence in the dollar began to erode, and each withdrawal pushed the US closer towards a dangerous truth: it couldn't cover its promises anymore. The world had started losing faith, and the dollar-gold relationship was cracking under the weight of America's own economic choices. By the early 1970s, the situation was slipping out of control. The amount of dollars held overseas had exploded, far surpassing the gold sitting in the US reserves. If every nation decided to cash in their dollars for gold, America would run dry, and fast. Economists inside the government warned that if the outflow continued at the same pace, the US could hit insolvency in less than 2 years. Foreign governments knew the numbers, confidence was fading, and the pressure mounted as more countries prepared to demand their gold back. Inside Washington, officials scrambled through emergency meetings, trying to figure out how to stop the bleeding without triggering global chaos. The system that once seemed unbreakable was now hanging by a thread. The US either had to fix the crisis or break the rules it had promised to uphold. On August 15, 1971, the US finally made its move. Nixon appeared on national television. He announced that the dollar would no longer be convertible into gold, calling it a temporary suspension. A word that sounded harmless at the time, but ended up reshaping the next 53 years. In reality, this was the death of the gold standard.
The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world.
The world didn't take it lightly. European leaders were furious. France compared it to a monetary Pearl Harbor, accusing the US of blindsiding its allies. Germany and Britain demanded urgent summits, scrambling to protect their economies. Markets immediately fell into chaos as currencies lurched and readjusted, unsure of what the new rules even were.
I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
With the gold gone, the world entered a new financial reality, one built entirely on trust. The dollar was no longer backed by anything physical, it was backed by belief, and to keep that belief alive, the US had to react. In 1974, Washington struck a quiet but game-changing deal with Saudi Arabia. All oil sold globally would be priced exclusively in US dollars. In return, America would offer military protection and political support. That single agreement created the petrodollar, locking the world back into dependence on the dollar even without gold. Nations now needed dollars not for gold but for energy, the lifeblood of every economy. The US had found a new way to secure dominance. But this shift came with consequences. Once money was detached from gold, governments could print freely. Inflation crept in, slowly eating away at savings. Wealth began concentrating at the top as assets. Stocks, real estate, commodities inflated far faster than wages. Crashes and bubbles became a feature of the new system. The 1970s inflation wave, the dot-com burst, and the 2008 meltdown, and the massive money surge during COVID-19. After 1971, the entire global financial system shifted from hard rules to political decisions. Without gold acting as a restraint, governments, especially the US, learned that they could manage crises by printing money, lowering interest rates, and expanding debt. This new era allowed massive growth, but it also made the world vulnerable. Real wealth began losing ground to inflation. Countries holding dollars as reserves found themselves stuck in a dollar trap. They needed the dollar for trade, yet every round of US money printing devalued the reserves they relied on. Meanwhile, US government debt ballooned. Instead of being a sign of weakness, it became the engine of global finance, with countries buying America's debt to keep the system running. But the cost was clear. True stability faded, replaced by cycles of boom and bust, and a world tied to a currency that no longer had any anchor except trust. Looking back, many argue the collapse of the gold standard was unavoidable. The global economy had grown far beyond the amount of gold available, and the US simply couldn't maintain the promise it made in 1944. But critics see the real issue wasn't inevitability, it was the way America handled it. Instead of reforming the system openly, the US protected its dominance by cutting off gold without warning, leaving allies feeling deceived and betrayed. Nixon's decision reshaped global power dynamics. The dollar became a fiat currency that controlled world trade, not because it was backed by gold, but because the US forced the world to depend on it. The trade-off was clear. America kept its influence, but the world lost the stability that a gold-backed system once provided. Inequality widened, currencies weakened, and the financial system became more political than ever. August 15, 1971 was a turning point that rewired the global economy. One decision ended the era of gold-backed stability and launched the world into a system powered by debt, politics, and trust. The effects have echoed for decades: rising inequality, inflated assets, and a dollar that dominates because the world has no alternative. Today, we're still living in the shadow of that moment, asking the same question Nixon avoided: can a monetary system built on faith alone survive the future?